What's up, Budget Wargamer? We are back with another edition, and tonight we're going to talk about Warhammer 40,000. Feels like it's been a while, but we're going to talk about Games Workshop's new big FAQ 1 and then how that's going to impact the game. There's some minor changes in there, but those can have big repercussions to how people play the game, as well as suggestions on some other stuff. So if you want to find out where they're hosting it, you're going to head on over to warhammer-community.com/FAQs. And you're going to want to select Warhammer 40K. This is where you could find the different army-specific FAQs and erratas, and then also your big FAQ 1. So I actually expected quite a bit more rules clarifications and more FAQ in here, being that it was delayed until April. It was originally scheduled to drop in March. Maybe they wanted to wait until after some more of these codexes were released. And then also, it's just not that many rules. It's not really highly in depth. But some of these clarifications are very key, of which we've got psychic focus and targeting characters. And the reason that these are first and foremost is that these are going to affect the majority of the armies out there. So let's take a look at psychic focus, which is aimed to reduce the amount of duplicate spells that are cast on the battlefield in any given psychic phase, with some caveats. And the caveats there are not meant to hinder any of the Psychic Brotherhood armies or something similar. These will not affect Codex Grey Knights, and it will not affect Codex Thousand Sons, where their troop choices actually count as psykers. So it says, with the exception of Smite, each psychic power can be attempted only once per turn, rather than once per psyker per turn. So if you're out there spamming psykers in your Imperial list or in another list, of which Smite is probably the most common psychic power, you're only able to cast all your other psychic powers, or attempt to cast any of your other psychic powers just one time per turn. So that means if you try to cast it with one psyker and fail, you can't come around and try to cast it again. So whether you're Blood Angels with a Librarian Dreadnought and then Mephiston or whatever, you can't try to cast the same spell more than once, except for Smite. And Smite is going to have a varying degree of difficulty based upon how many attempts you do. So you can successfully cast Smite more than once per turn, but each time that you attempt to, it's going to get increasingly difficult. So you can cast Smite as many times as you want with Brotherhood of Psykers or the Brotherhood of Sorcerers from these mentioned units. It says, with those exceptions, without those exceptions here, you must add 1 to the warp charge value of Smite for each attempt, whether it's successful or not, that has been made to manifest Smite during a given psychic phase to a maximum warp charge value of 11. So they're never going to make it impossible to get it off there, but if let's say you've got a base of 7 for your charge value, you roll 2d6, you get that off, the next psyker is going to have to roll an 8, whether or not it's successful. Next attempt's going to be a 9, so on and so forth. So it does not affect the outcome of the spell itself. Doesn't make the spell any weaker. Just makes it a lot harder to be able to cast that successfully. Now, in addition to that, we've got the targeting characters special rule, of which has been FAQ'd. And I still see a loophole in this, but at least there's some clarification that addresses a lot of the frequently asked questions that Games Workshop must have been getting, mainly at, I would assume, their matched play events. So it says an enemy character with a wounds characteristic of less than 10. So that doesn't count for like Lehman Russ special characters and things like that, like General Pask. But they can only be chosen as a target in the shooting phase if it is both visible to the firing model and it's the closest enemy unit to the firing model. That sounds kind of normal. It has to be closer and it must be visible. Ignore other enemy characters with a wounds characteristic of less than 10 when determining if the target is the closest enemy unit to the firing model. So a minor character can no longer shield a more heroic character by being slightly in front of it. You can actually take your pick there. And then it also says that this means that if any other enemy units other than characters with a wounds characteristic of less than 10 are closer, whether they are visible or not, then the enemy character cannot be targeted. So get this. Here's a way that your character could be wide out in the open, and then your enemy unit could be intentionally hidden out of line of sight behind a building, and somehow that enemy unit you can't even see behind a building is going to prevent you from shooting the character who's out in the open, even though he would be the closest visible enemy unit. This wasn't intended to be seen that way, but it was definitely intended to be seen to prevent people from like kind of pieing an angle and preventing the other enemy troop choice intentionally from being seen, even though it was closer, just to target the enemy model. So like creating like a sniper effect by forcing your unit to just kind of hide out of view and use a piece of intervening terrain or something like that to prevent you from seeing the other enemy unit. So that was the intention, but I could see this kind of being spammed where you can end up using your character out in the wide open, popping off targets left and right. Meanwhile, you have a like a zone-defying unit, like a unit of grunts or something like that, hiding behind cover out of line of sight behind some low terrain. And that would be like the cheesiest of things, but that's going to have to happen because that's the rules here, even though that may not be the spirit of the rules. That is what the rules state. So then we've also got beta matched play rules. So these don't have to be taken. These can be taken at the discretion of the organizing play or matched play opponent or event organizer if it's an official event. Changes to how tactical reserves take place. Changes to Battle Brothers. This is key here. All units in each detachment in your Battleforged army must have at least one faction keyword in common. In addition, this keyword cannot be Chaos, Imperium, Eldari, Ynnari, or Tyranids unless the detachment in question is a fortification network. This has no effect on your army faction. So there were some loosely assembled Battle Brothers units that were apparently flexing on this rule that were being a little bit broken, and that is part of the beta match play rules. It's not an official rule. So keep in mind that this FAQ includes official rulings and it includes suggestions and still some beta testing. So here we've got some erratas related to specific indexes that are already out there. Those are there. More importantly, you'll have some that are specific to different codexes that'll be here as well. Detachment command, big update here. Battalion attachments get +5 command points. Brigade detachments get +12 command points. This is an increase in command points for those size of battalions, and mainly due to the fact that Games Workshop felt that you should be able to take more advantage of the different commands that they've got available to you guys. So being able to take those and spend those command points on your different abilities, especially because there's so many now in each of the codexes that it's almost like an entire magic phase being able to use your command points. Tide of Traders. So something else appears here. Now you might find some specifically to your own army or some of your opponent's armies. Here's another one that is where rules were unintentionally overlapping because they weren't considered duplicates. They were considered different abilities. They've created a ruling here on ignoring wounds. So it says some units have abilities that allow them to ignore the damage suffered each time it loses a wound, such as Disgustingly Resilient from the Death Guard, or the flesh is weak, something like that. So if the model has more than one such ability, not including armor saves of course, you can only use one of those abilities each time the model loses a wound. So you take your armor save as normal. If applicable, you'll lose your wound. You can take Disgustingly Resilient, or you could take another special ability that may be granted to you by war gear, may be granted to you by spell or other effect in the game. You're not going to be able to take a 6+ followed by a 5+ or a 4+, whatever the case may be. You have to choose the better of your options and only take one of those after the save. So some people apparently were using different combos to their own benefit to make nigh unkillable characters that just dragged the battle out and made things a little bit unfair. So that ruling's there because of you guys. There's a couple more rulings that came about because of spam abuse during matched play. So here's some organized play, and of which this is where they draw on sort of the rule of 3, but it's not quite holding to it. Based on the amount of points from your organized play, up to 1,000 points, you can have 2 detachments per army. Up to 2,000 points, 3 detachments. Up to 3,000 points, 4 detachments. That's about as big as any organized play event's going to get. But this is the big one here. Number of times each data sheet can be included. This does not apply to unit with troops or dedicated transport role, nor does it apply to any units that are added to your army during the battle that cost reinforcement points. So here's where I see a little bit of a problem. So you can only use in a 2,000 point list up to 3 per army, regardless of the fact you can have 3 detachments. It's not 3 per detachment per army. So let's say you were Acadian gun line and you were wanting to put out a lot of heavy weapon squads. Well, you would put let's say 3 of those heavy weapon squads into one of your detachments. You'd pick another detachment like an armored spearhead detachment, just so you can have an HQ and more heavy support choices, just to take more of those heavy weapon squads. Well, according to this, if your organizer takes these suggestions, you won't be able to, because you can't use more than 3 of the heavy weapon squad's data sheets because they're not a troop choice or dedicated transport port. I see that as being a little bit of a hindrance, even to an army that is really trying to stay true to some of that. But there's got to be times when this must have been being greatly overused. Tau, maybe, were overusing this. Tyranids, people like that were spamming the heck out of their HQ, spamming the heck out of their elite choices and things like that. To try and take advantage of where they should have probably had a very limited number of them to begin with. But I feel like that could have rather been addressed by Eridas to the Codex, by actually calling out a maximum per army in each of those units. But I guess that's to be determined. I just feel like that does limit quite a few heavy support choices that maybe wouldn't have been quite intentionally spammed. Because, let's face it, if you're playing Imperial Guard or Tyranid, for example, some of those choices, whether they be fast attack or troops, are really something you're going to need to spam a lot of, or put a lot of them on the tabletop, just due to their really, really low points cost. So I see that as being a hindrance to some of those low model count armies where they really do want to take quite a bit more of those types of troop choices in particular. So there was an adjustment to some of the points here, Lord Commissar and Commissar, as well as how it affects Death Corps or Krieg. Some of these other ones to be of note, Robert Goumain's 400 points now, Hive Tyrant with Wings, 190. So just take a look at those if that's of interest to you, but that's the entire big FAQ1. It's really not that big, especially considering how much white space is even here on a 6-page handout. There's at least 1 full page of white space to be had here on the big FAQ1. So comment below what you'd like us to talk about next. Hit the subscribe button if this is your first time watching the channel, or if you just haven't subscribed to me yet, and hit the bell next to that for notifications. I do a few videos a week. Most of it's on Games Workshop games. If it's not, it's still going to be wargame related, hobby related to the wargame space. I always like to talk about what interests me personally, but I'd like to get to know what interests you guys quite a bit. And hit that like button if you watched it all the way to about the 13-minute mark here on the video. I really appreciate that. Really appreciate you guys watching. We'll do some more videos just for you, and stay tuned to Budget Wargamer.